Hello, everyone. This is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. How do you have the steps in your vendor process split? Are they all done by one team member? Are they split within the vendor team? Or, like some companies, are there separate departments handling separate parts of the process? And what could be wrong with that? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 125. How do you split your vendor process task? Plus an example. And that example, by the way, is going to be of how a 17-person vendor team processing 2,000 requests per month and how many team members were assigned to different tasks. All right, so let's say you have a manual or mostly manual vendor setup and maintenance process. How does your organization split those steps? Are they all with the vendor team, be it that vendor team in purchasing, in accounts payable, as part of, or the master data group or master data management group? Or are the steps split between departments? Or for that matter, are they split within the vendor team? So first, let's take a look at what those vendor process tasks are. Now, when onboarding a vendor using a manual or mostly manual process, typically one team member within a department can handle all of the related tasks, all of those steps. Now, I have 6 steps that I'm going to give, and keep in mind these are high level, and I know that they can be customized per organization. For example, I don't have anything in here about certificates of insurance. Sometimes that's kept within a different department, sometimes it's in with the vendor team. I don't have that in here, and there may be other steps in your processes that I don't have in here either, and there could be some steps in this process that you don't have but I do recommend. So let's start with number 1, and this could be one that I recommend that you don't have, and that is to, when you get that request in, is to authenticate the requester. And that's no matter whether they are a vendor or an employee who submitted the request, collected all the documents, and is submitting it on behalf of the vendor. And that's just because of fraud. Nowadays, you can't even necessarily trust, if you're getting those supporting documentations via email, then you can't even necessarily trust that the email, even when it looks like it's coming from a valid email address, that it's valid. There's so many instances of email account takeover where the fraudsters or cyber criminals have been successful with phishing and getting those login credentials that they sent the email from within the vendors or the employees' email address, so it looks like it's valid. So authenticate the request, and if you need to know how to do that, I will put a link to a on-demand webinar, and you can kind of skip around because it'll be on YouTube, and I have timestamps so you can get more information on authentication. The second one is, so you authenticate the requester, and then you receive or you review the supporting documentation that they submitted, right? So you're reviewing that they have everything that you require, such as the IRS W-9. If they're getting, would like to get a ACH or electronic payment, hopefully you have a company branded ACH form, and you're reviewing to make sure that they have all the supporting documentation. And then the step 3, so after you authenticate the requester, you review the supporting documentation. Now you're going to do all your validations. So that's your IRS 10 match, that's your OFAC watch list. If they are a vendor in the EU, for example, or one of the countries that have a value added tax or VAT, you want to validate that so that whomever in your organization reclaims the VAT that you pay on invoices, they'll have a valid number that they can use. And so you want to do all your vendor validations. And then the 4th step is if you have changes to existing vendor data, if that's what the request is, and you want to perform confirmation of those changes. So that is changes where it's change in banking, change in remit address, email. And just to put this out here now, you don't just want to do a confirmation for banking. You also want to do a confirmation for any data that relates to payments. So remit address can be checks, or the confirmation itself. That could be telephone number, email. You want to make sure that you're not only checking banking, because there are other pieces of data that affect payments as well as the reduction of fraud. And so you do want to perform confirmation. Now you can perform that confirmation. I know everyone talks about picking up that phone, and nothing wrong with that. However, I was able to work with my client who work with their auditors to get an alternative in place, because I don't know about you guys, but I know, but even before COVID, it was hard to get these vendors on the phone. And as everyone went home, it was hard for not only if you guys had a hard time trying to make sure that you were connected to the company email or connected to the company phone, your vendors had those issues too. And so some type of confirmation needs to be done. And I recommend that it's done as far as based on authenticating the requester, and then it's also done by requiring authentication on that banking form I talked about. And I've got some webinars. I actually have quite a few. Just go to my website, deborahrichardson.com, and go to the free resources. You'll see a list of webinars that will have more information on that confirmation, how to make that process easier. All right, so that was step 4. Step 5 is now that they have performed the confirmation for changes or completed the validations for new vendors, now comes the data entry into the accounting system or ERP. And then once that's done, if it's a new vendor, you're going to send them a welcome letter so they know how to do business with accounts payable, especially letting them know if they need changes in the future, how that needs to be done. And then or if it is a change in the vendor data, then you are going to send them a notification letting the vendors know that the change has been done. And I do have a separate blog on that, and I'll probably link it in the blog post, and then I'll put a link to the blog post in the show notes, so you can click through the blog post and then you'll see actually all the links that I'm talking about here today. All right, so that was the 6, and I'll repeat them because I was talking a lot through each one. But the first one is authentication of the requester. The second one is reviewing the supporting documentation. Third one is performing applicable vendor validations. Fourth one is performing confirmations for changes to existing vendor data. Fifth one is data entry into the accounting system or ERP. And then the 6th one is sending a welcome letter to the new vendor or sending notification of changes to existing vendors. So those are the 6. Now, assigning the tasks of this process can, again, vary by organization, where some organizations may choose to split these tasks to different team members or even to different departments due to limited staff or other reasons. And I do want to say here, I know of 2 instances, one where it wasn't a client of mine, but I think somebody asked a question and indicated that they had someone in payroll that was calling doing the confirmation calls for bank changes. And so that was a little that was a little different, and I'll talk about that in a minute too. But so I've heard of people in payroll doing that, and then I heard of again with the bank confirmation that being done in another department. So I think in that case it was a procurement team or purchasing team that was handling the vendor onboarding, and then I think it was the accounts payable team that was doing the calls, the confirmation calls. In any event, it could be flipped. There was a procurement team or purchasing team, and then also the AP team. They had split who was doing the vendor onboarding, and then or vendor onboarding and processes all the steps except step 4, performing the confirmation. That was in a totally different team. So let me talk about what I think is the issue with that. Or maybe this is just something you need to take into control or take into consideration, and then mitigate those any issues with maybe some compensating controls. So here's the problem: is least privilege access. So one aspect to keep in mind when determining if or how these tasks will be split is least privilege access. Now, least privilege access reduces fraud because it requires that access to vendor sensitive information like their banking, their social security number, etc., be restricted to only those that need access to that information. Now, when performing these steps, the more team members that are required in the process, the more team members that have access to the vendor sensitive data, either within the vendor master file or through handling the supporting documentation. So for example, if there are multiple team members that all have access to edit the vendor master file and thus already have access to vendor sensitive information, and the steps are split up, that should not be an issue. So if you've got a vendor team and you don't have one person handling that same request the whole way through, it's not going to be a problem, because all of the vendor team members will have access to that sensitive information anyway, because they have access to the vendor master file. If, however, team members outside of those that have access to edit the vendor master file are brought into the process, now those team members will now be exposed to the vendor sensitive information and will have access to perpetrate internal fraud, or will now be susceptible to release vendor sensitive data in an external fraud scheme. So if you've got a vendor team that has access to the vendor master file, but you've got a whole nother different team that is doing the bank, for example, the bank change in banking, those confirmations, that means that team or those team members are handling the supporting documentation, and they have that vendor's banking in their hand. And that means that those team members will now also be exposed to the vendor sensitive information and will have access to perpetrate internal fraud, or will now be susceptible to release vendor sensitive data in an external fraud scheme. So if they are the target of a fraudster, of a cyber criminal, they've got that vendor's banking in their hand, and so they may be the weakest link in the security chain, as the users always are. And so that's why I think it really needs to be restricted and limited, and least privileged access needs to be followed at all times. I do understand, however, if there are limited team members in departments, just keep that in mind. And if you have to split up those tasks where sensitive information is in the hands of employees that don't have access to that information in the system, then there needs to be some type of controls that are implemented so that you avoid both internal or occupational fraud and external fraud. Now, before I get to the example, I want to talk a bit about the sponsor of this podcast. On this podcast, I talk a lot about avoiding bad vendor data, and that includes vendor addresses. A tool that I personally use to validate vendor addresses is Smarty Streets. Smarty Streets is an online tool that will let you not only standardize US and non-US addresses, but it also goes further to tell you if the address is vacant, inactive, or only a P.O. box. With individual and bulk lookups, make sure you use Smarty Streets to validate your vendor addresses. Check out smartystreet.com/AP to get 250 free U.S. address checks today. Now let's get to the example. So when I was a practitioner processing over 2,000 requests per month, all vendor process tasks were performed within the vendor team. Now, I did have a 17-person team, but not everyone was assigned to processing those vendor requests. And we also had requests from each region. So we had US, Canada, we had APAC, LATAM, EMEA, and so you'll see that it was split accordingly. So we're just going to go ahead and start. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different functions or areas that they were split. The first one is U.S. vendor requests. Now, I had 6.5 team members, and they handled the review of the supporting documentation, validations. I should have said authentications first. So they handled authentications, review of supporting documentation, validations, vendor change confirmations, and also the entry into the accounting system or ERP. We did have the sending of the welcome letter. That was something that was automated as long as we had had an email on file for the vendor. Any vendor that didn't have an email and they had a change, we actually had that same team member had to handle the generating a manual letter to the vendor's physical address or mailing address. Now, did I say that they also handled the entry into the accounting system or ERP? So they handle all the steps. Now, what's funny here is that during the starting actually kind of October-ish, but not really full time. But from that point in time, doing some of the vendor cleanup and some of the pre-work through January and then part of March, I did pull 2 of those team members out so that they could handle the 1099s and 1042s that needed to go out by January 31st and then March 15th. So 2 of those team members were pulled out. And actually, I think we might have had them working on something else part of the year. Sometimes, depending on how the request, what the volume was, I would kind of rotate. But on a normal basis, mid-year, 6.5 team members handled all of the U.S. vendor requests. Now, non-U.S., the second area, non-U.S. or international vendor requests, there were 2 team members, and again, that was APAC, LATAM, and EMEA, and they handled, again, the authentication, review of supporting documentation, validations, vendor change confirmations, entry into the accounting system, again, with that automated notification. We didn't have an automated welcome letter, and as a matter of fact, we didn't do a welcome letter, but we did do the notification for existing vendor changes. All right, so that was 6.5 team members on US, 2 team members on non-US. Now, most of you should be aware that you get those notice of change requests from your bank. Now, I had a half a team member assigned to that function, and the other half of them, that was the 6.5. So the other half, they dealt with the U.S. vendor request. Now, these are those emails, or you might still be getting them via fax, that you get from your bank notifying you of changes that the bank made to the banking data you included on your pay file. And if these changes are not made in a timely manner, your company could be susceptible to notch fines. So I had someone that was assigned to grab those notifications, research them, and get those updated in the system. And most of the time, it was where the routing number had changed because banks merged, and vendors never tell you that. That's another reason why you need to clean your vendor master file and then check that. Because what's the recent one? I think it was BB&T and another bank, SunTrust. They merged, and they have like a whole new bank name now, and so that is a new routing number. So you need to check those. And so I had someone assigned, a half a person assigned to notice a change request. Now, the next two are the help desk. We actually did have a separate vendor team help desk. I had it separated. I had one for US and Canada, and I had 2 team members assigned to that. And they handled all the telephone and email inquiries. And then the same with the non-US or international help desk. They handled all APAC, LATAM, and EMEA. And I also had 2 team members on that. Although the volume was a lot lower, but they handled all telephone and email inquiries. It wasn't a lot of telephone. It was more email, but we had a lot more issues with non-US or international payments. And so even though it was international, and that really was a smaller volume of vendors in our vendor master file, it still ended up being a large volume or similar volume of inquiries. And the other thing that too that was unique here is that bilingual team members were a plus. I think I had one that was bilingual and then one that wasn't, and we can work with either, but it was a plus having that one person that was bilingual. All right, and then the next one, so this is number 6, was project work. Now, I actually had 3 team members that were assigned to project work. So these were higher level team members that handled projects such as robotics process automation, so we could automate eligible manual tasks. And I really thought that was a privilege to be able to have someone on the team that could upskill and learn a RPA platform and identify eligible manual tasks that they could then automate within the team. So that was really good. And then, of course, we implemented the vendor self-registration portal, and so I had folks assigned to that. And then, of course, there were other items that required research within the vendor team. We always had some project going on where the vendor team would need to come in and represent on that project for the vendor processes, and that's where a team member would go into that. So I had 3 team members to do that, and so all of that is 16, and the 17th person was a supervisor. It was one supervisor. Actually, at one point I had a couple of supervisors, but we reorged, and I ended up with one supervisor, and that supervisor supervised all the team members except for those that were performing the project work, and those folks reported to me. So that was an example of a 17-person team and how I split those out. So I hope you got some value out of here, out of this podcast episode, and was able to at least have a takeaway and take a look at, who has access to your vendor master file, who has access to the vendor supporting documentation that can also include sensitive data, just like vendor master file can. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 125th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable team members are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.